So what I hope to be able to do in the next 12 to 15 minutes is to summarize very briefly what I think all of you hear a lot from the media constantly, what I think what's wrong with that and what's right with that. And then I'll just go back to theory, just to show you that there is a gap between what we talk about and what theory says we should be talking about. And then I'll talk about how, when we do a diagnostic at the policy level of what's working, what's not working in theory, we rely on a number of predictable criteria, which are quite robust. And there's a lot we know about what these criteria tell us. And I'll use this to try to sort of convince you that there are a number of recurring patterns that we've been able to identify, and there are solutions, luckily. But the solutions are not to copy some other country or something like that. The solution is, as always, to think. But we know we have a better sense of how to think about these sort of issues. So the typical media-oriented story that we get is 3 points. They tell us that we need more money, that we need to cut costs, and that we need to think about rebalancing the financing between the public and the private sector, depending on the context. This is what you keep hearing, right? Indeed, we do need more money. We don't have enough money. We have lots of people who don't have access to water. Indeed, the costs seem to be quite excessive. We don't seem to manage to come up to efficiency level which are consistent with the kind of stuff that we think about. And I'm not talking about the financial efficiency. I'm talking about the economic efficiency, which takes into account the fact that we have less and less water, that producing water is more expensive. These sort of issues have to be picked up also. So these are important points indeed. But if you pay attention to what is being said in the media, most of the time, regulation is not really taken seriously into account. They pay lip service to it, right? I mean, they mention it, but it's really not in the first line of all of these discussions. And to me, it's odd. It's odd that we don't talk about procurement, for instance. I mean, the way the markets are being allocated is a very technical process. And we have sort of standardized this process in a very strange way that does not internalize a lot of stuff that we know from theory. If you look at the telecom sector, for instance, the way procurement is being done in telecom is very, very different. And it's not just for technical reasons. It's just for differences in preferences for the technology that's being used to award markets. I think the water sector is lagging in many ways. And the same sort of comments apply to the way we think about regulation. You have some countries who go by the book. You have some countries that do it quite well, that do it very transparently, but largely because you have individuals who've decided to do so. The systems are not organized to make us think about regulation without individuals, in a sense. And that's part of the problem. And I don't think this is being discussed enough. So we do have a problem with skills, we have a problem with commitment, we have a problem with commitments, and this should be influencing the way we look at regulation. So in a sense, it's useful. I mean, I always think it's so useful to go back to basics, right? When we think about economic regulation, I'm an economist by training. My job is to advise governments and to work with governments to implement policies and to think about regulation. When we talk about that, we have a number of incredibly predictable variables that we focus on. What we want is to come up with a set of restrictions, of rules, that can apply to both the public and the private sector, that can actually also apply to consumers in some cases. And these rules will define prices, they will define returns, they will define quantity sometimes, they will focus on quality, and they will focus on the rules of entry and exit in the sector, which is my procurement story. And we have a clear purpose. When we're looking at these variables, at prices, we look at returns, at quantity, at quality, and at entry-exit rules, we have a very clear purpose. We want to influence efficiency. We want these things to lead to an allocation of resources which makes sense from the point of view of the country. But we also want to have equity in this business. We have lots of people who don't have access to water, who can't consume as much water as they need. We have some people who can do more than others, so we have equity issues. And of course, we have financial sustainability. Water and transport are the two most subsidized sectors. They're incredibly costly fiscally. And most of the time, this is not being recognized. So we want more money, but we already have lots of money in the sector. Is this money being used efficiently? So that's the kind of stuff we focus on. When we reassess the extent to which prices, quality, quantity, and returns are being monitored, we have in mind these efficiency, equity, financial viability concerns, right? That's pretty much what theory tells you. And theory, frankly, is quite effective at guiding us on that. But there is a bridge between what theory tells us we should be thinking about and what is being done in practice. we do have a number of predictable questions. When we think about efficiency, for instance, I mean, if you pick up any sort of report on the water sector at the EU, at the World Bank, or the UN, they will, I mean, are the costs being minimized? Is consumption accounting for the opportunity cost of the sector? Is investment being made at the right time, at the right speed, with the right technology? So these sort of issues are being asked, right? But they're all ad hoc, and the same stuff applies to equity. We were having this conversation about how much we're spending on water. Well, depending on how you define, how you normalize your expenditures. I mean, we spend about 4% of our expenditures are spent on water and sanitation and related expenditures, apparently, according to Eurostat. 4% of money. And this is true for all of the quintiles. Some differences of 10% between quintiles. It's a lot of money. It's really a lot of money. The UN are telling us that we should be below 5%, but we're getting below 5% in many countries by rationing, not because we're pricing right. So that's one issue we want to think about when we think about equity. And then we have one concern with the speed at which we're doing stuff. Why is it somehow that every single time we have a lag in investment decisions, we can predict who's going to be losing? The winners and losers are incredibly predictable. The poor get, most of the time, penalized by the failures that we have in regulation in making the right decision. This is, think about South Asia, think about Africa, for instance, where this is the most obvious, to Central America. So in a sense, I mean, there are lots of things like that which are quite predictable, which are being anchored into theory, but which are being translated into very simple indicators, which are only partial indicators. We don't have the big picture. And if I think about fiscal or financial viability, one of the things that I keep thinking about is that, I don't know if you know this, but this is one of the highest dividend-paying sectors. So we have a sector in which we don't have enough money, but we're paying very high dividends. So how do we reconcile that? For those of you who are interested, the debate is taking place in the UK right now. Ofwat messed up a little bit the monitoring of the way they were allocating the borrowing by the private companies, right? And a lot of this borrowing was used to pay dividends and CEOs, rather than make the investment. It is, I mean, it's not a violation of regulation. It was allowed by regulation, but it's a consequence of us, in theory, for instance, designing regulation that ignore finance. But in practice, the implementation of financing comes from financial decisions. So these are the sort of issues which we don't pick up well enough, and which I think are on the research agenda for many of us. I know there are a bunch, at least 10 theses, PhD theses, working on this topic right now. And then there's this incredibly complicated topic, the fourth policy criteria. So we talk about efficiency, we talk about equity, we talk about fiscal and financial viability. And when we start thinking about why is it not working, there's a fourth criteria which comes out naturally, which is accountability. And accountability is a very complex concept, right? The first thing that comes to mind to many people, I guess the very first thing that will come to mind will be corruption. I'll say a few words about that in a few minutes. But the question is, when bad decisions are being made, are the people making decisions being held accountable? Is the system taking into account the fact that we have either incompetent people, or partially competent people, or corrupt people? Do systems take that into account? And this is not just about the water sector. It's true about every regulated sector. We have a problem with that. We don't seem to be able to do this quite as well as we would like to do that. Part of the problem is because the decisions are a lot more random than they should be. No, we're supposed to be designing rules which are relatively predictable. We want to give some flexibility to the regulators, but these things don't really take place the way we want. This is related to the fact that monitoring is not taking place. So we're having problems with the design of monitoring. And if monitoring is not working well, the odds are that enforcement is not be working well. So that's another issue that we need to think about. And again, keep in mind that this is not just one country, right? This is based on a meta-analysis of what's happening around the world, and this is a meta-analysis of lots of papers which have been written on this topic. So there are solutions which are being discussed. For instance, the EU comes up with very interesting guidelines, but these guidelines assume that all of the countries have the same competence, the same skills, the same resources. So we standardize decision-making processes, and standardization, instead of making things more accountable, may be making things less accountable. So this is one issue that's coming up, that's been coming up in the last 2 to 3 years. So if I have to try to come up with a way of pointing to things which I would put money on, I guess, research money on, I have a list of 10 points that I would like to make to conclude this discussion. So I've already said that I think procurement process can do a lot better. So I'm not going to talk about that. I think regulatory designs should be considering a lot more the kind of stuff that some countries do well, but not as many countries as I think should be doing it. The distinction between CapEx and OpEx, the benchmarking exercises, the mismatches between goals and preferences, the confusion between the willingness and the ability to pay when we're designing tariffs. These sort of issues are also very predictable, and when you diagnostic, there are recurring themes. The third point is that I think it's, I don't know what the word is, but there is some degree of, I guess, innocence would be one way of saying it, or arrogance would be another way of saying it, of making sure that we recognize that pricing to achieve efficiency, equity, financial viability is incredibly complicated. Somehow you have trade-offs. And the decision as to where you go with the trade-off is really a local decision. I mean, the regulators need to decide that. But what I'm arguing is that these things should be more transparent and certainly a lot more analytical than they are today. I've already mentioned my fourth point, poor monitoring and enforcement, and it's easy to have a look at that. You just have to look at the budget. One of the easy ways in which you don't get regulation is to cut the budget of the regulators. They won't be able to monitor, they won't be able to enforce. A fifth thing I would work on would be the allocation and coordination across government levels. Lots of countries have been changing the definition of responsibilities and mandates in the water sector. And what I find very interesting when you look at the OECD database, for instance, is that you see it's quite common to share mandates. So you have some of the rules are done at the national level, some at the regional level, some at the municipal level. There is very interesting research on Canada and on Brazil that you may want to have a look that shows that if the political parties at the three government levels are not the same, that you have coordination problems. So you're trying to do the best you can by splitting mandates to get closer to where the decisions should be making. But politics matter, and politics make a difference in the way things actually get implemented. So that's another point that comes into the story. A sixth point, which I think is very important and which is not studied at all except by one research center in Seattle in the US, is the quality of auditing in regulation. I mean, I know in Spain, for instance, the National Auditing Office is extremely legalistic. In other countries, it's extremely economics. And I think we need both perspectives. And when you hyper-specialize the auditing, right, I mean, you're allowing the firms to be able to make a difference in the sense that makes them profitable, not the users, not the taxpayers. Since she told me I only have 1 more minute, and I already speak very fast, I'm going to go very quickly to the last 4 points, right? I think so. I've told you about the fact that auditing is quite weak. And I also think that the mandate of the auditors and the regulators is quite incomplete. We have very good auditors, we have very good technically regulators, but they don't get the full mandate that should be getting to get the job right. And in a sense, the solution that has been evolving has been misleading. In a sense, our reaction has been, we have problems, so let's make things more complex, more difficult to cheat on. But the more complex things are, and the less money you put on budgeting, on enforcing and monitoring, the more complicated it is to actually implement the more complicated rules. We've already talked about the ignorance of the financing strategy. There's lots of research on that stuff. And then there is a final point that I would like to make, which is I think I just went through the smart city presentations. Everything is about technology, right? We have new data, new way of producing data. And I guess the water sector is adjusting to that. But this raises incredibly complicated question. Should data be regulated by the water regulator, or should it be regulated by the telecom regulator? And if you start paying your bills with your phone, should it be the banking regulator that looks at those things? You have a new allocation of responsibilities between different types of regulators that is not being discussed. Again, there is very sexy research on regulation on those folks. The last slide, and then I'm done, is that there is a lot of information that we've learned. There's a lot we know about what is not going right. And one of the things that seems to be working well in practice is to try to make things maybe simpler than they are. We don't know how to deal with complexity very well, but we know how to deal with simplicity. We understand the differences. So my sense is the way, when I do a diagnostic of a country, I start by the institutions. Are the institutions capable of doing what I want them to do? And if I don't know to do that, I need to match my tools, my regulation, with the institutional capacity. And this is, to a large extent, relating to a need to match the tools and the institutional limitations with the data that I can have, the information asymmetries that I have. Of course, this depends on political commitment, on bureaucratic commitment. But in all cases, I think that arguing that we can do everything is misleading. We should be more humble, maybe, when we talk about regulation, because there's a lot we don't know.